Welcome to the first episode of Planet Possible News, where each month I'm joined by an environmental expert and we'll explore issues that are making the headlines, keeping you right up to date with what's happening globally across water, nature and climate. So today we're joined by a familiar voice to many, the President of CIWEM, the Chartered Institution of Water and Environmental Management, John Curtin. And we'll be discussing whether the UK government will set targets for how resilient we are to adapting to climate change, the impact of the current crisis in Iran on energy and climate, and the national approach here in the UK to managing incidents and crises, and how communities are both engaged and can respond. So welcome to Planet Possible News, John.
Brilliant to be here. The award-winning Planet Possible, Niki. Well done. Congratulations to you and the team. Fantastic.
Thank you, John. That means a lot. We're very delighted, and thank you to our audience who voted for us, because that's why we won, which is wonderful. It's great to have you back. I'm really looking forward to hearing more about the stories that you've picked. So let's get straight into it. Our first story is about climate change targets. Tell us more.
Front of mind for me at the moment is a new report that's coming out next month. So a bit of a heads up to everyone, from the Climate Change Commission, called Well Adapted UK. So the Climate Change Act is about 20 years old now, so 2008. Two arms: mitigation, how we decarbonise the economy. But the other really important arm to the Climate Change Commission, which I work with a lot, is about adaptation. It's safe to say that there has been progress on mitigation. So the original Climate Act set an aspiration for 80% reduce of carbon by 2050, which is now net zero. And over half of our carbon has been removed since that time. Conversely, adaptation, the last update the Climate Change Commission did on how well adapted we are to climate change, was not so good. So they measure over 40 different outcomes across the UK society and government. And of those 40 different outcomes, like the health service resilience, flood resilience, heating in buildings, not a single outcome achieved good. So not a single element of our society is ready for climate change. And a couple of them had gone backwards since the last assessment. You've got mitigation, which is making progress, not without controversy, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But adaptation has had progress, as in the evidence has been defined more clearly, and there are quite a lot of policies, but it's the actual action bit that's missing. And the reason why I think it's really important, what it's likely the Climate Change Commission are going to come out with in their report next month, is they're going to be pushing hard for at last having measurable outcomes for resilience. What does good look like? Where are we aiming for? They're probably likely to also say that our scenario we should be aiming for is 2 degrees warming. So that's above Paris by 2050. That will drive, I think, us from the stage where we've got the evidence and the policies into action. I saw an example of how difficult this is for governments, because governments are pretty good and usually pretty consumed by acute issues to the expense of chronic ones. So as an example, one of the things that's talked about a lot is a lot of our prison stock is old Victorian buildings that are really difficult to change because of the heat they're going to have in the future and the sort of exposure they're going to put to prisoners. And so they need rectifying. So that's a chronic issue with our prison stock. Will not be able to deal with warmer summers in the future. But the acute issue is our prisons are full and there are demands to put more people in them. And that grabs the politics. So we're not dealing with the longer term chronic issue. And you could repeat that for dozens of other aspects where the acute issue trumps it. I mean, another great example that the Climate Commission highlights, to just show that this isn't theoretical, this affects all of our lives, is in their last report. They said that nearly 20% of all surgeons in this country said that they had cancelled an operation because it was too warm in the theatre to do it. 20%. So it's affecting the health service. So it affects all of our lives. So I think this is really important, because we'll shift from just having reports from a commission saying that we're not ready to saying, well, what does ready look like? And if I can give one more example, and I worked in the Environment Agency, flood risk metrics, for example, is how many homes you protect from flooding, which is brilliant. And the EA have done some fantastic work again recently, I think, of really smashing their targets. But if you think about it, how many properties you protect is sort of just a gross number. If you're not also saying, well, how many more are in the floodplain because of development, or how many more are exposed because of increased climate risk, it's the net difference you're interested in, not just another 60,000 homes are protected. What is the net difference that we're seeing over time to know whether we're resilient? So that's the switch, not just here's the homes protected, what is the overall exposure to flood risk over time. So watch that report. If it needs consultation, I think all of our voices will be really important. The next national adaptation plan is in 2028. So there's a bit of time for government to say, this is what the Climate Change Commission is saying, this is what other sectors are thinking, before they'll actually make that move. But I think this could be a really pivotal moment in resilience in this country.
Are those targets likely to be ones that it's the government's responsibility to meet? Given that so much of adaptation is stuff we could do ourselves, or at least is at our householder level, is it likely that we'll have targets as granular as at property level, this is what we want to achieve? Or is it likely to be nationally, we've got a measure of resilience and how well adapted we are to a changing climate?
I think it'll be 3 layers. I think the absolute certain layer will be government departments will be having standards. So Department of Transport, which now will be taking over the rail network, will have standards for how it needs to adapt. I think then certain regulated industries, so the big coma sites, the ones that are most vulnerable to chemical and hazards, etc., they are really exposed to extra heat. So I suspect regulating coma sites will mean that you'll have certain climate adaptation standards. So I think it will go into business. Into individual, I think, is where it gets into politics, doesn't it? So how much does the state tell you what to do? And I'm not sure. I'd love to be engaged with the consultation around this, because I think our voice needs to be in there about what the state does and what individuals do. And I think we'll pick that up later. So I'm pretty sure we'll have those first 2 tiers. The third one, who knows? But you need the third one, because everyone has a part to play in this. It's not just the state is going to adapt for me. We are all going to have different lives. And that doesn't have to be negative. The story about climate can sometimes be very preachy, like you must all be vegetarian or whatever. But the reality is the world I grew up in, the climate I grew up in, is not the one that I'm going to end my life in. And so you have to change. But humans have always adapted. But this is a fascinating moment, pivotal, that we'll start saying this is what good, resilient climate change looks like, and this is the common standard for which we should be planning.
We've been lucky to have members of the Climate Change Committee join us on the pod in the past, and they certainly talked about how actually the UK's approach, even having a Climate Change Committee, is quite world leading. So not only will it be interesting in terms of what that does within the UK, but actually setting adaptation targets, I suspect there might be a trend, if it's not already happening, that we potentially see globally. How do we stop it or slow it down? But also, how do we make sure that we're ready?
The reason why that's really important as well, and we touched on this before, is I think a lot of people are now starting to understand that a long time it was a discussion between do you mitigate or do you adapt? And we're now well beyond that point. We have to adapt whatever we do. If we don't produce another gram of carbon as a society, sea levels are still going to rise, summers are still going to get warmer and winters wetter, which we just need to build into our thinking.
Following on with the climate theme, I was really interested to think about the impact that the current conflict in Iran is having on the environment. So I've picked a couple of stories, some work by Carbon Brief and a research scientist at the University of Miami, whose name I hope I do justice to is Hura Daha. There are 2 main themes that have come out of this for me. One is the conflict itself and the fact that that has generated quite a lot of greenhouse gas emissions, and there are wider environmental impacts through strikes on oil facilities across the Gulf region, and even things like longer aviation and shipping routes as companies avoid the area. And the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, we know, has meant oil prices have skyrocketed to sometimes over $100 a barrel. And I'm interested to think about what that means to our energy security. So I wanted to share a stat, John, with you that I thought was quite striking. If the world's military was a single country, then they would have the 4th largest carbon footprint behind China, the US and India. Yeah, I mean, it's huge, isn't it? And it's estimated, because it's difficult to get those numbers, but it's about 5.5% of global greenhouse gas emissions comes from military. And here's another good stat that came out of Hura's paper. For every $100 billion increase in military spending, 32 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent is generated. There's something really powerful when we talk about current state of global affairs and how we need to increase military spending, that we at least are very mindful that there is a very direct tie-in between the environmental impact of even just spending the cash on those military assets and the environment. And obviously Iran isn't the only conflict that's happening, clearly, but for me, I suppose, because it's in an oil producing region, it feels even more clear. We've obviously seen impacts on both the population, which has been horrific across the region, but also infrastructure. And Tehran recently experienced black rain, which is a mixture of oil and water falling from the sky. You probably saw on the news. I can't really imagine what we're going to find when this all calms down. And also in Lebanon, I was reading that the Bakasin pine forest, which is the largest pine forest in the region, is having forest fires, which is a combination of drought, likely to be climate change related, and then also airstrikes, which are just triggering these fires. Some of that is probably fairly obvious. I was then interested in what's happening beyond the conflict zone. So 30 nations have cut fuel taxes, so that's interesting. We're driving, in some respects, continued demand. But the South Korean president, Lee Jae-myung, said that he thought this was a good opportunity to swiftly and extensively transition to renewable energy. And that, for me, is, if there is any, I mean, I wouldn't go as far as to say it's a silver lining, but it is at least starting to have conversations around our dependency on fossil fuels and our connectivity into that international market. We've seen in the UK some pressure on the UK government to reduce restrictions on fossil fuel extraction at both Jackdaw and Rosebank fields in the North Sea. And as we record this, we're expecting the Energy Secretary, Ed Miliband, to announce a package of measures that will recommit the government to clean energy security. So things like solar panels, electric vehicles. So what we were just talking about, that kind of property level, how can we enable that to happen in a more affordable way? And also, I think really interestingly, and it'd be interesting to see how this plays out, delinking gas and electricity prices to reduce consumer bills, because at the moment renewables are kind of tied up in the fossil fuel pricing market. And The Guardian reported, interestingly, that Octopus Energy, so a big renewable provider, have seen a 50% rise in solar panel and heat pump sales since the war began. And March was the best month ever for EV sales in the UK.
There's a lot there. Fascinating. It's interesting hearing you talk about the stats, especially about defence, because, of course, climate change will drive heat in those countries that are currently in the conflict. So you've got an extra cycle of pressures on those communities. I think one of the most fascinating things about this is, in the last couple of years, if you and I were having a podcast around solar renewables, it would be a climate story. But this is now a national resilience and economic story. If history shows you one thing, national crisis, national resilience and economic crisis can drive change. So there's an interesting way we go here. I'm kind of biased. I see the days now, there's some days where more than half of our electricity is from solar and wind, and I look out the window and I love to see, blimey, look, half of what I can see out there is being powered by just nature, which is fantastic. But conversely, when my bills go up, I grumble about the price of my heating, but I can still heat my home. I'm blessed with that. The one frustration I have in this debate is that it's now shifted into a culture wars debate where everyone's shouting at extremes, okay? This is really nuanced and really complicated and needs nuance and complicated solutions, because if you think about it, we're actually talking not so much about a generation issue, as in generating power. It's about complete reconfiguration of a national grid that has existed for 60, 70 years, which was designed to bring you and I power from big coal power stations in Yorkshire and East Midlands, and now, big single point production sites, to a more dispersed system. So I actually think the debate between political on this is not that far, because it's just about pace. Those coal power stations will not exist. We do need a new grid system, but you also need to make sure that energy is affordable to those in our society who will struggle the most. So I think we need to talk about how you transition that and what other levers you have. So there's a fantastic story that came out last week from NESO, which is the new National Electricity System Operator. It's like a government-owned regulator on this, which said that what they want to do is, rather than at the moment on really sunny days when lots of solar, they actually pay to turn off solar panels because the grid can't take it, is if you have a smart meter, they're going to alert you and say you can have free electricity tomorrow afternoon between 2 and 4, go and put your washing machine on. Those sort of things where people can feel a material difference in their lives from the positivity of renewals is what's brilliant. And if Ed Miliband does decouple gas from the electricity price, that'll be a massive move, because gas is still a minor part of electricity, but sort of sets the prices, which makes a lot of this unaffordable. So I've always been optimistic about this. I think if we can get to something where we're not reliant on global politics for the price of our energy and global shocks, to something more sustainable and local, why wouldn't you? But the pace of change is what we need to look at, and the impact on all parts of society. And that's where the polarisms become, when people start talking about, you and I are having this wonderful conversation about net zero, but I can't put the oven on a Sunday for my kids to give them hot food. But no, I'm optimistic. You've got to go this way. You've got to go this way. We're not going to have coal power stations. And the destination is brilliant from an economic point of view, national resilience point of view, and a carbon point of view. It's just how we get there. So I just hope we'll have a bit more of a nuanced debate rather than everyone screaming from the extremes, I think.
Yeah, making sure, we talk about just transition, but really that means making sure that everybody can go on that journey. I think that's the point.
What people need to clock, I suppose, from my perspective, I have looked at this quite a lot recently, is we're not talking about just an energy transition. It's a whole system transition, a whole configuration from how we get energy that we've been used to since the Second World War. It's a massive systems switch. And there's the one thing I've learned from my time in government: system switches in government are hard and difficult, but the prize is amazing if we can get there.
So for our final story, John, we're going to talk about the national approach to managing incidents and crises. And as someone who's held some really big jobs where crisis management was, I imagine, a fairly regular activity, I'm really keen to hear your thoughts on this.
It was quite interesting because I nearly clocked up 100 Cobras in my time, which is, I was told I'd probably do one or two. So,
and for our international listeners, just tell us briefly, what's a Cobra?
Cobra is rather unexcitingly Cabinet Office Briefing Room A. So it's a bunker under number 10 in Cabinet Office where the Prime Minister or other senior parts of government manage all the nation's response to a major crisis, whereas in my case, floods. So yeah, I did nearly 100 of those. But the reason I want to talk about this is because I've been working and looking at this quite a lot since I've left the Environment Agency. And I was struck, for example, by, if you remember Storm Bert in the winter of 2024, which flooded hundreds of homes in Wales. And there was quite an interesting debate in that people were saying, we were not warned by the Met Office because you had a yellow warning for heavy rain. And the Met Office saying, no, our yellow warning was right because we have this risk matrix where we measure likelihood of something happening and then impact. And this was a very low likelihood of a high impact, and therefore we measured it yellow. So our warning was right. But to be frank, who apart from a flood professional who gets a yellow warning will think they are going to have hundreds of properties flooding? This has got me to thinking about something which I call the response deficit, and just give me a moment to describe it. So if you broadly think of a crisis and how you manage it, especially flooding, there are like 4 stages in a chain. So the first stage is you detect something is coming. So there's a storm in the Atlantic or thunderstorms are starting to emerge over Midlands or London or whatever. So you're detecting something. Next stage is, right, let's forecast where and when that thing we've detected will affect communities. So you forecast the time and the location. Right, so that's the second stage. Third stage, right, now let's warn people. We now know it's coming. We now know it's these towns. We now know it's that time zone. Warn the people. But the important fourth stage is you have to have someone who receives that warning and can respond. Because if I don't respond by saving my life, my family's life, my property, are you really getting the full value of that chain? That's why I call it the response deficit, because we have, as a nation, invested millions into detecting, forecasting and warning incidents. And actually, I think England, UK is probably world leading. But unless you have that response element right, are you actually going to get the maximum to that chain? So another example, as you know, the government's rolled out this new mobile phone alerting system, which alerts your phone in a major crisis where you actually not where you live. So it's based on the mobile phone masts. Very sophisticated, actually. They can create a semicircle or a circle to even direct the signal. But if you and I, say, as flood professionals, say you're away from your home, you're in a hotel, 3 o'clock in the morning, your alarm buzzes off with this government alarm system and says, severe flood warning, be safe. Do you know where to go? Do you know what to do? Do you know where your car is? Is that somewhere? Do you think, if, blimey, my kids aren't with me, I need to go to them? You know, it's brilliant that you have these new warning systems, but unless we are equally good at understanding how communities respond, we're not going to get this extra element of resilience. And the reason why I think it's also important is Cabinet Office have started talking about, and Cabinet Office in government in the UK also lead on incident management and the Cobra system we talked about. Cabinet Office is talking about what they call as a whole society response to incidents. And this could be floods or droughts or wildfires or whatever, so clearly driven by climate as well. And they say there are 3 things we need: better shared understanding of risks, understand everyone's role outside of government, which is really important because a lot of people still think it's the state that will protect me from these things. If I flood, it's a failure of the state, not to do with me. And the third one is where we started this conversation. Resilience is built into the system for what's to come, not that we're just good at responding to the crisis. So I think it's a really powerful piece of work about rebalancing community resilience, making them feel like they're being helped though, not abandoned. So if I just end on this, the journey around property level resilience is a good example. In the past, property level resilience, where the flood resilience is in someone's home rather than at a community level, used to be seen as the last resort. EA or Natural Resources Wales, whatever, will build a flood defence. If they can't do that, we'll fiddle around with the catchment with some nature-based solutions. If that doesn't work, then we'll do property level resilience. And it's felt like that from communities. Whereas in the future, we're going to just need this massive mosaic of resilience where you'll need good land management, good nature-based solutions, traditional defences, and communities resilient. But that will only work if people feel that's part of their deal with the state. This is the state doing their bits and this is my bit. Because if you really are going to rely on property level resilience to be a part of the future of this nation's resilience, and Minister Hardy and government are pushing hard on it, you need to know that that individual will be able to use those gates, not just the winter to come, but next winter, 5 winters, 10 winters ahead to the same sort of standard. And that's quite a lot for us to work through on how people feel they're part of an issue and that isn't just the state's role to protect them in the future. So a fascinating piece of work, really difficult. It's been a generational shift, I think, to perhaps erode community resilience. I'll give you one last example on that. I went to a town that was flooded to meet the community, which I used to do a lot at the Environment Agency. And they showed me around and, horrific stories. And we got to their village green, and their village green had a load of small rowing boats that were used as plant pots for flowers, as they're trying to get Village of the Year, Bloom Award, whatever. And I said, what are these boats? And they said, they were our grandparents' boats. Because every winter in this village, before the flood defence was built, they used to row across to get from one part of the village to the other. But of course, we built the flood defence. You create a sort of myth of protection in that community, and their rowing boats are now plant pots because they no longer think it's a risk to them. Whereas it always has been, and will get more so in the future, but that's generations where infrastructure has sort of eroded that community resilience, and it'll take a long journey to get people there. But you have to be part of it with them, knowing that you're playing your part and they're playing their part. So I think this is a really fascinating area. And if anyone out there has got any great stories about building resilience in communities on this sort of stuff, then please let me know, because I'm fascinated to try and learn from the best.
That's brilliant, John. Thank you. There's a lot about adaptation in our conversations this morning. That feels like a real thread, doesn't it? How do we individually and at state level get ready for what is coming, really? That is, sadly, all we've got time for. But thank you so much for bringing such interesting stories, John. And thank you to you for joining us on this episode. If you don't already, then subscribe to Planet Possible on your usual podcast player to never miss any of our episodes. And if you want to follow up on the topics that John and I have discussed today, or join our mailing list and be the first to hear about new episodes and guests, head to the show notes wherever you're catching this podcast and you'll find out a little bit more there. Our next episode is out next Thursday. So until then, that's it, everyone. Stay curious, stay connected, and we'll see you next time.